Okay, so we've had a brief introduction into some of the parts of the immune system and some of the ideas behind why it works. We're going to talk in a little bit more detail about how the immune system works. Again, we're still taking the 10,000 foot view. We're not going to get into too many details. I'm just trying to find the sweet spot here to let you get enough of an understanding so when you talk to your doctor, you sort of understand what's going on in your body. And so this section we're going to talk about the innate versus the acquired immune system. And so basically your immune system has two broad responses, the innate response and the adaptive response, which is also called the acquired response. And so I'll slip back and forth between the two. Sometimes I'll call it acquired, sometimes I'll call it adaptive. It's the same thing. The most important thing is you've got the innate response and the acquired response. And you need to understand, what's unique about each of them. The innate response is your first line of defense. And so it's a very quick response, but it's not very specific. It's just designed to try to keep as much out as possible, no matter what the pathogen. Your adaptive or your acquired response takes longer to become activated, but that's because it's very specific, and so it's very well tuned to attacking a specific pathogen. And a big advantage of the adaptive immune system is it provides long-term immunity. And so once you are infected with a particular pathogen, often then you'll never get sick from that pathogen again because of the adaptive response. And so we're going to compare and contrast these two a little bit. And so here, as a paper cut, you get this stuff all the time. You get, I cut myself shaving here. This stuff happens a lot. And of course, that allows pathogens in. Now, your innate immunity, your first line of defense, are some of those things I talked about earlier. Some of those barriers that are designed to keep pathogens out. We talked about how skin is really good at keeping pathogens out, and mucus and stomach acid. There's other things too. There's other enzymes on your skin and in your body, in your mouth, and that will digest and break down bacteria and pathogens if they get into your body. And oils that help to keep things out, and other chemical reactions that help keep pathogens out of your body. You also have lots and lots of friendly bacteria, which we call mutualism. And so mutualistic bacteria are those organisms that live in your gut, and a mutualistic relationship is one where both organisms benefit from the relationship. And so you've got lots of bacteria where, you provide them a place to live and you provide them food, but then they help you digest and they help you fight off other bacteria. So that's something that is a fast growing area of medicine, is understanding your intestinal flora. And we see lots of situations where having the population and the community of bacteria change in your gut has huge effects on your health. And a lot of times it's because those bacteria help to outcompete and to fight off other bad bacteria. And so that can be considered part of your innate immunity. Also, other responses that occur when you get a cut. You get inflammation, right? You get a cut, you hurt yourself, you get a bruise, it swells up, right? There's a lot of blood rushes there, and lots of chemicals get released when those cells get broken. So inflammation is designed to help capture and stop pathogens from getting into your body. And there are things like cellular attacks. So you have white blood cells that are part of this innate immunity. And a good example of this is a concept called phagocytosis. Phagocytosis means eating cells. And so this is just one of the cellular responses that are part of your innate immunity. And so here's a figure kind of showing phagocytosis from a macrophage. So a macrophage is a type of leukocyte. Remember we said there's all types of, a leukocyte's a white blood cell. There's all different kinds of them. And so a macrophage is just one kind of white blood cell. But it's an interesting white blood cell in that it can hunt down pathogens, engulf them, and digest them. And that's part of your innate immune response. And so that's what they're showing you here. They're showing you this macrophage that's eating a bacterium and digesting it. And so this is not a very sophisticated response, but it's very effective. And so it's not very specific. It's not looking for a specific bacterium or a specific virus or a specific fungus. It's just, it recognizes this doesn't belong. It swallows it and digests it. And so this is a very important part of your innate immune response. And this is what happens very rapidly. This is your first part of your first line of defense. And so here's a cool video that someone put on YouTube showing this. And so this is a macrophage chasing, it may not be a macrophage, it might be a neutrophil. It's just a different kind of white blood cell. It's a white blood cell. It's actually, you can watch it chase down this bacterium and engulf it. So these white blood cells are what we call amoeboid cells. And amoeba is a cell that, has cytoplasm, doesn't have a real well-defined shape, and it's got motility, and it can move. And you can see that this is a cell chasing down a bacterium. And so that cell is sensing chemicals that the bacterium is giving off, which allows the cell to keep following it and eventually to engulf it and then digest it. And so this is a cellular response of your innate immune system. So that's pretty cool. Well, ultimately, that's sort of the fate of all these pathogens and their relationship to your immune system. Ultimately, you're going to have cells of your immune system that are going to take these pathogens and eat them and digest them, and that's how you get rid of them. Now, most animals only have this innate immunity. I'm sorry, yeah, I want to make sure I was on the right slide there. And so innate immunity is common among all animals, and for most animal groups, that's all they've got. But vertebrates like us and other vertebrates, and fish and reptiles and things, we also have evolved the adaptive immunity. And the adaptive immunity is another step, which is, again, it's much more specific, and it helps us to deal with pathogens better. And so this helps to explain the evolution of vertebrates and one of the advantages that evolved that gave our ancestors an advantage over other organisms. And so here's a cladogram just showing some major animal groups. And we're not going to get into too many details here, but you can see that if you go to the bottom here, you got like cnidarians, that's like jellyfish, right? Arthropods, insects and lobsters and things. And nematodes are roundworms, and mollusks are clams and snails, and annelids are segment worms, and so on and so forth. You've got all these different groups of animals, and they have innate immunity, but they don't have this acquired immunity. But if you look, gnathostomes, which are vertebrates with a jaw, like us, and anathens, which are other vertebrates that don't have a jaw. And so it's things like lampreys, which is a type of fish. We have this adaptive immunity, and that's one of those things that evolved that gave our ancestors an advantage and gave our lineage an advantage. So as we've mentioned a few times, this acquired adaptive immunity is very specific. And so whereas the innate immune response is just like, whatever, I'm going to go try and eat it. The adaptive immunity is tailored for a specific pathogen, a specific virus, a specific bacterium, whatever. The trade-off is it takes longer to respond. And so it takes a while to ramp up this process. It takes a while for this process to kick into gear. And while this adaptive response is starting to try to respond to the pathogen, over a matter of days, that entire time the pathogen is reproducing like crazy, because that's what pathogens do. Right? The pathogen has defeated your innate immune system, and now it's reproducing very rapidly, and that is why you feel sick, because it's your body's telling you, hey, something's wrong, and the byproducts of this infection are making you feel bad, and so you feel sick because your adaptive immune response takes a while to get rid of this pathogen. But a huge advantage of the adaptive response is once you've been exposed to a specific pathogen, you usually are immune to that pathogen from then on. And so subsequent infections by that pathogen are no big deal. And that's a huge advantage, because again, you're being constantly bombarded with these. And so if each time you're bombarded with a new pathogen, you eventually get immunity to it, well then that's just one fewer pathogen that you have to worry about the rest of your life. Okay, so how does this response work? Central to the idea of the adaptive response are those antibodies. So we've talked about antibodies a few times. Let's talk about them in more detail and what is it they do and why are they so important. Another term for antibody is immunoglobulin. So if you ever see IG, that's what they stand for, immunoglobulin. And these are proteins, and again, proteins are all about shape, and these have roughly a Y shape. And they've got heavy chains and light chains and things. You don't have to worry about too much. Don't worry about those details. And as with all proteins, shape is critical to function. And the interesting thing about antibodies is there's billions of different shapes. They're all just a little bit different. They don't have to be very different, right? But right now in your body, you have billions of different antibodies, and they're all shaped a little bit differently. These antibodies are produced by those B cells, right? So you've got those lymphocytes that are produced and mature in the bone marrow, and one of their functions is to produce these antibodies. And so when you get an infection, you've got that pathogen gets in your body. Remember that pathogen has foreign proteins on its surface that are called antigens. And if you have an antibody with the correct shape that matches that antigen, it will bind to that antigen. And that's critical to immune system function. And so again, here's this picture I showed you. Now I said they're Y-shaped. This doesn't really look Y-shaped, but don't worry about that. The point here is that this particular antibody has just the right shape to bind to this particular antigen, but it won't fit any other antigens from any other proteins. That's the specificity of this adaptive response, is that there's an antibody for this particular antigen, for this particular pathogen. And that's the only thing that antibody is good for. Any other virus, any other bacterium, any other fungus, that particular antibody is probably not very useful. And so here, this is kind of showing you the idea of the Y shape of the antibody. And at the tips of the Ys where you've got this antigen binding site. And so each antibody has a very specific shape on this end that will only fit a particular antigen. That's the specificity. That's why it's very specific response. Now, here's a question. How does your body know what pathogens it needs to fight off? Right? So you've got this antibody that's perfectly shaped for a particular antigen. And so you get this virus, and this antibody is perfectly shaped for that virus. How did your body know that? How did your body know to produce that particular antibody? Well, the short answer is it didn't at first. Your body takes a different strategy. Your body's strategy is what we call a shotgun approach, which is let's produce billions of antibodies, each of them with a little bit different shape. Law of averages says somewhere in those billions of antibodies, there's one that will fit any antigen that gets into my body. Okay? And, you say, well, that seems kind of inefficient. But antibodies, don't take a lot of energy to produce. They're not very big. And there's really no other way. There's no way to predict what kind of antigens and what kind of pathogens you're going to get in the future. And those pathogens are constantly evolving. And so there's no way to know, what shapes of proteins are coming into your body that you need to attack. And so the best thing you can do is let's just produce every shape we can think of, and chances are one of them is going to fit. And so the genes that produce these antibodies, those particular genes mutate a lot, and then the genes are arranged in a way that you can do different combinations of gene products. And so these particular genes happen to be able to produce lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of different shaped antibodies. And so the reality is that you're carrying the antibody for a particular pathogen before you're even infected with it. So most of you are probably carrying an antibody for COVID right now, even if you haven't had COVID. And so that's pretty interesting, right? But you don't have very many of each antibody. And so, although you've got a match somewhere in your body, it takes a while to find that match. It takes a while for that specific antibody to bind to the specific antigen of whatever's infecting you. And in the meantime, that pathogen is reproducing and reproducing and reproducing and reproducing, and that's making you sick. So that's part of the reason why you're sick for a few days, is even though you've got the matching antibody, you don't have many of them. And you have to wait, and at some point that antibody finally has to bump in to the pathogen and bind to it, and that kicks off the rest of the immune system. But that takes a while. But once the proper antibody is found, once that matching antibody binds to the pathogen, then your B cells will make billions and billions of copies of that matching antibody. And that's pretty cool, right? And you remember those T cells, those cells that mature in the thymus? Some of those T cells help with this process. And so that's kind of what their role. The T cells do a lot of things, but that's one of their roles, is to help the B cells make lots of copies. But you're making copies of the antibody that's a perfect fit for this new infection. That way you don't waste energy making copies of antibodies you don't need. And you don't waste energy making copies of antibodies until you actually need them. But again, this is why you're sick for a few days, because it takes a few days for the right antibody to be found, and then it takes a few days to make billions and billions of copies. And then eventually, you start to make enough antibodies that you start to control the infection and then eliminate the infection. But in those first days, until that happens, that's when you feel sick. But that is pretty cool. And so, in this example, we found the antibody that matches this yellow antigen. And once that happens, that triggers the beta cells, the B cells, to make billions and billions of copies of this very antibody. The very antibody that we need. Now we're going to put energy into making copies of it. And only that one, because that's the one we need to respond to this antigen. Now, if you have other pathogens with different antigens, you must find a different antibody to match each specific antigen. And so you got to do this for every unique antigen. Somewhere you've got that matching antibody, but it's got to bind to the antigen, and then you got to make copies of it. And so that's again, once that happens, once you find that match, then your B cells make billions of copies of that matching antibody. And so that's what I mean by ramping up this acquired response. You're going to make copies of the necessary antibody. And again, you probably have a matching antibody for a new infection even before you're infected. Why? Because of that shotgun approach. Because your body's strategy is to just make all these antibodies, and they're all shaped a little bit differently. Chances are there's going to be a match in there. But you only have a few matches. And so it takes time for that match to be found. And then it takes time to make copies of that match. And during that whole time, you feel sick for a while. So, again, if you haven't had COVID, you probably have a matching antibody for COVID. If you do get it, it'll take a while for your body to find the right antibody and then to produce that right antibody. And then hopefully you'll fight off the infection. Okay. So we've made a big point about we've got to find the specific antibody for this pathogen. And we need to make billions of copies of it. Great. But why? We've just made copies of antibodies. How does that cure you of the infection? What do antibodies do? So yeah, we found the matching antibody. We've made billions of copies of it. So what? We still have this pathogen. We've got to get rid of it. Well, there's a couple things that the antibodies do. First off, remember that the antibodies are perfectly shaped to bind to the antigens. Remember what an antigen is. That's that protein on the surface of the pathogen. That's that protein that we use to identify self versus non-self. That's a non-self protein, and these antibodies that we've made billions of copies of perfectly match that and can bind to that protein. And so we start to cover the pathogens with these antibodies. Remember, the pathogen has those foreign proteins on its surface. That's how we recognized it was a foreign body. These antibodies are the perfect match for that antigen, for that foreign protein. And so they're going to start binding to it. And so you've got these bacteria or virus or fungus or whatever, and it starts to get covered by these antibodies. And that does a couple of things. First thing it does is it marks the pathogen for destruction. Now all of a sudden, you've got this pathogen and it's covered with your antibodies. And so it's got those antibodies, your body recognizes that those are your antibodies. It's got your antibodies and it's got foreign proteins and you've got your beta cells and all these cells in your immune system are releasing all these chemicals. Anyway, it labels that pathogen for destruction. You'll recall back when we talked about the innate system, we talked about how some leukocytes can hunt down pathogens and surround them and eat them, right? We showed you the video of that white blood cell eating a bacterium. And you've got macrophages, and you've got cells with the best name ever, killer T cells, that are cells in your immune system. Those are white blood cells whose job is to go find pathogens and eat them and destroy them. Well, those pathogens that are covered in your antibodies are easier to find. They're easier to find and destroy. And so that's a big function of antibodies, is to mark pathogens for destruction by other white blood cells. Another thing that the antibodies do for you is this pathogen's just covered in antibodies, it gets smothered. And the pathogen just can't function like it does. It wants to divide, it wants to get into a cell, it wants to do all these things that are part of its life cycle, but it's covered in these antibody proteins. And so that causes the pathogens to stick together, or they can't get into the cell now because they've got all these other extra proteins or whatever. Just by simply being covered in antibodies, the pathogen also can't function. That's another way. So that's why antibodies are so important, and that's why it's important to have so many copies of the matching antibody. So, big picture, after several days, we get infected, and after several days of being infected, we found a matching antibody to a new pathogen. We made billions and billions and billions of copies of this matching antibody. And then we've destroyed the new pathogen by marking it with antibodies, and then either, having other cells come and engulf it, or just by smothering it. And in that way, we're able to fight off the infection. We killed the pathogen and eliminated it, and now we're not sick anymore. That's awesome. Now, here's an even cooler aspect of this. Now that we fought off this pathogen, we have billions of matching antibodies for this pathogen. And so when we started, we only had 1 or 2 matching antibodies, and it took a long time to find it, and then it took a long time to make lots of copies. But now we got all the antibodies for this particular pathogen that we need. That's pretty cool. And we also have the antibody factories. We also have those beta cells. Remember how did we make all those copies of that antibody? We had those B cells that made a gazillion copies of that matching antibody. We still have those B cells. They don't go anywhere. And they just circulate in your blood, and they're ready to go whenever you need them again. And so whereas it took us a while to find this antibody, and it took us a while to, crank up the factories and start producing tons of that antibody, now we've got that infrastructure in place. And so now we can make copies of that matching antibody way quicker and in way larger numbers than we could before. So the next time we're infected with that particular pathogen, we can rapidly create the matching antibodies and quickly eliminate the pathogen. We don't have that waiting period anymore. We've got the infrastructure. We can eliminate the pathogen before it really builds up. And so the pathogen never really builds up, so it never really makes you sick. That's what immunity is. And so that's why this is such an amazing part of your immune system. Once you've been exposed to something, you often then never have to worry about that thing again, because you've identified that antibody, and you've got the B cells that will make that antibody, and they're already there. Well, this is what a vaccine does for you, and this is how vaccines work. And so a vaccine is just introducing that antigen in a controlled manner. And so when you get that antigen, your body recognizes that as a foreign protein, and so then your body is stimulated to find the matching antibody to that antigen, and then to make billions of copies of that antibody. But the vaccine is in a controlled setting. And so, why doesn't that vaccine make you sick? Well, sometimes it does. And sometimes you don't get when you get a shot or you get a vaccine, they say, hey, you might run a small fever a little bit later. You might feel punky for a day, right? And, it's because you are purposely stimulating your immune system, and you are purposely putting those foreign proteins in your body. But usually you don't get anywhere near as sick as you do with the actual pathogen. That's why we say it's in a controlled manner. You're putting those antigens into your body. Remember that the antibodies bind to that antigen. And that antigen, that's a surface protein from a pathogen. So it's a surface protein on a bacterium or a surface protein on a virus or whatever. Often the vaccine is just that protein. It's not the entire bacterium. It's not the entire virus. All your body needs is that antigen. It's the antigen is what the antibodies respond to. And so if you just put that antigen in, there's nothing else. There's no virus, there's no bacterium, there's nothing to make you sick. And so you can make the matching antibodies without anything else going on. Or sometimes, it's the whole pathogen, but the pathogen's been modified, so the pathogen can't reproduce. It's the virus has been killed in some way, or it's been genetically modified. And so you're putting that pathogen into your body, and your body is going to be stimulated to create antibodies to it, but the pathogen has been modified so it doesn't reproduce. So again, if it doesn't reproduce, it doesn't produce huge numbers, it doesn't really make you sick. But your body still is able to recognize that foreign protein, find the matching antibody, make copies of the matching antibody without you actually getting sick. That's what a vaccine does. And so the pathogen's not growing inside you, and so you're not getting sick, yet you're still producing the antibodies. But then if later you get infected by the real pathogen, the live virus, the live bacterium, if you actually catch that, you've already got billions of matching antibodies, and you've got those memory cells, those B cells, that can produce billions of copies of that matching antibody very quickly. And so when you get the real virus, your body immediately recognizes it, and it's already ready to go, and it produces a tremendous amount of antibodies, and you jump on it before it can reproduce in your body, and you don't get sick. Or at the very least, you don't get as sick as you would. And so here's a graph kind of showing you again, just to illustrate this concept. And so what we're looking at here, on the x-axis, you're looking at, days. So day 0 is when you first get the vaccine, when you're first exposed to the antigen. The y-axis is the antibody concentration. So it's how the concentration of antibodies in your blood. Notice it's a log scale. And so, as we look at some graphs, I want you to pay attention. Sometimes you'll see this. You see it's a log scale. You see how each division, it doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4. It goes 1, 10, 100, 1,000. It's like the pH scale. Like each unit jump is actually 10 times more. And you often do that in graphs where things change very rapidly. And so if you plot the raw numbers, the curve just gets too curvy. And if you plot the log of the numbers, you can often see the pattern a little bit easier. That's just what we're doing here. At any rate, you'll notice that for several days after you get the vaccine, you don't detect any antibodies. And that's because, the antibodies are there, but there's only 1 or 2. And it takes days for those antibodies to match up to that antigen that was in the vaccine. And then it takes days for that, once that match is found, it takes days to start firing up the B cells and producing copies. And so you don't see anything for several days, and then you see a big spike. Because eventually, those B cells start making copies of the matching antibody. And then you see what it's calling the challenge immunization. That's the second time you're exposed to the antigen. And so maybe that's when you actually catch the virus. You actually get the thing you're being immunized against. But you see what happens when you, first off, when you get that challenge immunization, you see the antibody levels have not dropped to zero. They've dropped quite a bit, but there's always some antibodies, lots of matching antibodies in your blood. When you very first started, there was like 1 or 2. Now there's a lot, you know. And you've got those cells that can make copies of that antibody very quickly. And so you see that after you catch the real virus, after you've been vaccinated, the rise in antibodies is incredibly quick and it's incredibly intense. The numbers go up faster and they peak much higher. And so you have this immediate, just overwhelming antibody response. Consequently, the virus or the bacterium, whatever, never has a chance. You jump on it before it can do any damage. That's what vaccines do for you. And so that rapid rise in antibodies means you mark and smother and remove the pathogen before it can really begin to multiply, before it can cause any trouble. You might not even know you're ever sick because your body just jumps on it so fast you never even realize that you've been exposed to the virus. That's what vaccines do for you. Okay, last thing we need to point out is that these pathogens evolve. And so, although our immune system is a very good evolutionary solution to this problem, we're in a constant battle with these things. And so these parasites and these pathogens, they are constantly evolving new ways to get around our immune system. And so it's what we call this evolutionary arms race, where we're just constantly evolving responses to one another. That's biology. That's what's been going on for 3.5 billion years, is organisms constantly evolving, trying to find new ways to increase their fitness. These pathogens are no different. And so your antibodies are binding to antigens, which are those surface proteins, right? And so any pathogen that has a mutation that gives it a little bit different protein that changes the shape of that protein now has an advantage. And so those pathogens are constantly evolving new proteins. And so you may have developed immunity to this particular virus and you have a match to this particular protein, but a related virus has a slightly different protein, you don't have a match to it. And now that virus, when it infects you, has an advantage. And so when a new pathogen evolves, chances are you've only got a few matching antibodies, and so you're not yet immune, and the whole process starts. And it's just constant evolutionary battle that's going on. And so this is what happens with viruses. This is, there's lots of ways that viruses and bacteria and things can evolve, and this is why, for example, you need to get a flu shot every year. Because every year, the flu virus is a little bit different. Those antigens on the surface are a little bit different shaped. And so although you got a shot last year, and you've got antibodies that are matching the proteins from last year's flu, well, this year's flu has evolved. And now its proteins are a little bit different shape. And so you probably don't have many matching antibodies. But if you go get a shot for this year's flu, you'll create those matching antibodies. That way, when this year's flu comes in, you're ready for it. But then next year, a new one's going to evolve. So that explains why, for a lot of things, you've got to get shots, very often. For some other things, you get one shot and you're good for your whole life. Or maybe you have to get a booster here and there. It just depends on the particular pathogen and how quickly it evolves. Okay. So last thing I want to touch on real quick is just immune disorders. Lots of diseases can be linked to misfunctioning of the immune system. And so the immune system is just not functioning the way it should. And so that's a lot of the things you can catch. For example, sometimes you get a harmless antigen, like pollen, that doesn't really make you sick. It's not really a threat, but your immune system recognizes it a threat and overreacts to it. Well, that's what allergies are. Allergies are an overreaction of your immune system, often to something that doesn't really pose a threat, but it is foreign. And your immune system recognizes it as foreign and just goes haywire and attacks it, and you don't really need to. Well, that's one explanation for what an allergy is. Some diseases are what we call autoimmune diseases. And so remember that differentiating between self and non-self is critical for immune system function. But if your immune system does not have the ability to do this, then your immune system can attack your own cells. And that's a type of autoimmune disease. And so things like type 1 diabetes or multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis, those are your immune system attacking your own cells because they don't recognize your own cells. There are also types of diseases that are immunodeficient diseases. And so this is a disease in which your immune system doesn't function like it's supposed to, right? And so severe combined immunodeficiency, which we often call bubble boy disease. So some people are born with an immune system that just doesn't function well. And so they have to be in a controlled environment, because if they're exposed to a pathogen, their body does not respond to the pathogen. It does not eliminate the pathogen. AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, is an immunodeficient response. And so parts of your immune system, if you have AIDS, parts of your immune system don't function like they're supposed to. And so you're susceptible to a lot more pathogens, things like that. So one thing I've noticed is that we're starting to recognize a lot of diseases as having some sort of like autoimmune aspect to them. And so this whole concept of recognizing your own cells versus other cells is, pretty critical, pretty interesting. Okay, so like I said, there's our overview of the immune system. Hopefully you've learned something that you weren't familiar with, and hopefully that what we've learned here will be able to apply and understand, medicine and treatment and things in a little bit more detail now. So that's really all I have to talk about right now. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. That's all I have right now, so I'll talk to you later. See ya.